The tension in the house was the tension of something that had already been decided. The Duke would offer for Consuelo, and she would accept. I had been in Miss Consuelo Vanderbilt's service for 3 years when the summer of 1895 arrived, and by then I knew her well enough to notice when something had shifted, even if no one had yet spoken of it plainly. She was 17 that year, and before long it became quietly understood in the house that her future had begun arranging itself around her. An English duke had come to Newport, a man she scarcely knew, and letters passed between rooms, conversations lowered when servants entered, and gowns began to be fitted for reasons no one quite named aloud. Little by little, I found myself helping prepare a young woman for a life across the ocean that seemed already decided, whether she had chosen it or not. I did not choose Consuelo Vanderbilt the way one might choose a friend, or a cause, or a piece of music that stays with you into old age. I was assigned to her. That is how these things work, and I have never had reason to pretend otherwise. A position is offered, references are checked, a room is shown, a salary is named, though in households of that kind, the salary is almost beside the point, because the household itself becomes your world, its rhythms your own, its calendar the thing around which every other thought arranges itself. My name is Anne Wilkes. I was born in 1865 in the village of Abergavenny in Wales, the third daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who took in fine mending. I came to service at 15, and by 30 I was a lady's maid, which is to say, I was a particular kind of woman, trained in a particular kind of invisibility. I knew how to dress hair so it looked as though it had arranged itself. I knew which gloves were for morning calls and which for evening, and I knew how to remove a stain from silk without leaving the memory of where the stain had been. I knew how to pack a trunk so that nothing inside it moved. I knew how to stand at the edge of a room and see everything in it while appearing to see nothing at all. This is the skill no one tells you they are teaching you. They teach you the gloves and the silk and the hair, but the seeing, that you learn on your own, because your survival depends on it, and so does your mistress's comfort, which amounts to much the same thing. I had been in the Vanderbilt employ for 4 years when the summer of 1895 arrived, and I understood, as did everyone in that household who possessed any powers of observation, that the summer was going to be unlike the others. There was a particular tension in the air at Marble House in Newport, a tension that was not the usual sort, not the tension of social arrangements and dinner placements, and whether the Astors would be invited to the yacht race. This was older and quieter and heavier. It was the tension of something that had already been decided. Newport in the summer was, as it always was, an exercise in the performance of leisure. The cottages, and they called them cottages, though each one would have swallowed a modest English village, stretched along Bellevue Avenue and the Cliff Walk, and in the mornings the carriages went up and down, and in the afternoons the ladies called on one another, and in the evenings there were dinners that lasted 3 hours and required 6 changes of dress between the soup and the going home. Marble House was not a gentle place to work. It had been built for Mrs. Alva Vanderbilt. She was Mrs. Alva Vanderbilt then, though she was working hard that summer to become something else, and it wore its grandeur the way some people wear a declaration. White marble floors, gilded ceilings, reception rooms that echoed even when they were full of people. The staff moved through it efficiently and quietly, and we understood without being told that we were background to a tableau that had been designed before any of us arrived. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 17 years old that summer. She was tall, taller than was considered quite the thing, with dark eyes and a bearing that had been trained into her from infancy. I had dressed her hair for 3 years by then, and I knew her face the way you know a room you live in, every angle of it, every shift of light. I knew when she was tired before she said so. I knew when something had been said to her that she had not yet processed. I knew the exact quality of her silence when she was composing herself, which was different from the quality of her silence when she was simply present. That summer, the composing silence came more often. The Duke of Marlborough arrived in Newport in August. His name was Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, and he was the 9th Duke of Marlborough, and he was 23 years old, and Blenheim Palace, the great Baroque house in Oxfordshire that his family had occupied for 2 centuries, was, as everyone in both the English and American aristocracies understood, in considerable financial difficulty. The house required money the way a ship requires water. It simply could not exist without it. The Vanderbilts had money. This was, in Newport in 1895, not a complicated calculation. I watched him at dinner the first evening when he came with a small party that included his cousin Winston Churchill, who was 16 or 17 then, and very loud about everything, and 2 or 3 others whose names I have since forgotten. The Duke was not particularly tall. He was careful in his movements, the way a man is careful when he has been taught that carelessness is something that happens to other people. He had the accent, which in those circles did a great deal of work. The American ladies at the table, and there were 8 or 9 of them, in their Worth gowns and their diamond parures, leaned slightly forward when he spoke, as though proximity to the accent might yield something. Consuelo sat across from him and was very correct. I watched her be correct all evening, from my position near the door to the corridor. I had been asked to stand by in case any adjustment of dress was required, which sometimes happened and mostly didn't, but gave us a reason to be present. She spoke when spoken to. She smiled when smiling was indicated. She ate what was put before her, in the quantities her mother would have approved of. She asked the Duke, I believe, about his journey across the Atlantic, because that was the sort of question one asked, and he answered, and they both performed the conversation as though it were a thing they were doing for the first time, rather than a thing they had both understood was coming. I thought, watching this, she already knows. I could not have told you then what exactly she knew. I could only say that her body carried the knowledge before her mind had perhaps finished receiving it. The set of her shoulders, the way her hands lay in her lap, not loose, not fidgety, but arranged. The way arranged is different from relaxed. I went to bed that evening and lay awake for a while, listening to the sea. The fittings began in September. Mrs. Alva Vanderbilt, and I must tell you something about Mrs. Vanderbilt, because you cannot understand the summer of 1895 without understanding her, was a woman of extraordinary will. She had built Marble House. She had forced her way into the 400 when they did not wish to admit her. She had divorced William Kissam Vanderbilt in January of that year, which was a thing that respectable women in New York simply did not do, and she had survived it, had more than survived it, had made it look like the beginning rather than the end. She was short and sharp-featured, and she wore her certainty the way other women wore their jewels, conspicuously, without apology, as a statement of position. She was, I think, one of the most formidable people I have ever known. I say this without any warmth particularly. Formidability is not warmth. She had engaged a dressmaker from Paris, not Worth's as might have been expected, but a lesser house that was nevertheless excellent, and the woman came to Newport with 3 assistants and a great number of samples, and the fittings took place in Consuelo's sitting room, which looked out over the water. I was present for all of them. This was my function, to manage the pins and the threads and the tissue paper, to keep the samples in order, to help Consuelo in and out of the things being tried on her, to smooth and adjust and hold. I stood very close to her for many hours over those weeks, close enough to hear her breathing, and I learned a great deal from her breathing. She was being fitted for a trousseau, The word was not used, not yet, because the engagement had not been formally announced. But we all understood what a trousseau was, and what the occasion for one would be. There were morning gowns, and afternoon gowns, and evening gowns. There were riding habits and travelling costumes. There were items of underlinen in such quantities that I cannot recount them without feeling again the particular exhaustion of cataloguing them. Each thing was measured against her body, adjusted, noted, sent away to be made up, returned, adjusted again. Through all of this, Consuelo stood very still. This is a skill that wealthy women learn, the standing still. You cannot fidget when you are being fitted. You cannot slump or shift or scratch an itch without consequence. You must simply be present in your body and allow your body to be worked upon, and eventually you begin to understand yourself as a surface, as something upon which things are arranged and displayed, rather than as the person doing the arranging and the displaying. I thought about this during those hours, about what it does to a person, years of being stood and fitted and arranged, about whether the standing still becomes, after long enough, a habit of the interior as well as the exterior. There was one afternoon in late September, a grey afternoon, with rain at the windows and the sea the colour of pewter, when the dressmaker and her assistants had gone to their luncheon, and Consuelo and I were alone in the sitting room with half-finished gowns laid over every chair and the smell of fabric and chalk dust in the air. She was standing at the window in her corset and petticoats, her corset, which had been drawn in to the fashionable 18 inches, because this was the year that waists of that dimension were required, and she was looking at the water. I was folding tissue paper into the shapes required for the packing of bodices. I was doing this quietly and systematically, as I always did. I was not looking at her. In that household, you did not look directly unless invited. She said, without turning, "Anne? Miss Vanderbilt? Do you think Blenheim is very cold in winter?" I paused in my folding. I considered the question. It was the kind of question that had several layers, and I was not sure which one she was asking about. "I believe it is rather large," I said finally. "Large houses are often cold." She didn't reply for a moment. Then, "Yes, I expect they are." She went on looking at the water. That was all. It was one of those conversations that contains, compressed inside it, a much longer conversation that neither party will have. I went back to my tissue paper. She went on being 17 years old and standing at a window and thinking about a house in England she had not yet seen and a life she had not yet chosen. And the distinction between those two things, the not yet seen and the not yet chosen, was, I thought, precisely the thing she was standing at the window thinking about. I have carried that conversation with me for a long time, the compression of it, the weight of what was between the words. The servants knew, of course. Servants always know before the formal announcement, because formal announcements are the last stage of a process that has been conducted in rooms we also inhabit, at tables we also move around, in the corridors we also traverse. The information does not come all at once but accumulates. A letter from London, a visit from a lawyer, a particular quality of attention that descends over the household like a change in the weather. By October we understood. The Duke would offer for Consuelo, and she would accept. The settlement was being discussed, or had already been discussed. There were figures mentioned in the servants' hall, very large figures, that we repeated to each other in the way one repeats numbers one cannot quite believe. Marlborough would receive $2.5 million in railroad stock. There would be an income of $100,000 per year. Blenheim would be saved. I tried, during those weeks, not to form opinions. This was also a skill of my profession, the maintenance of a functional neutrality. You could observe without judging. You could understand without pronouncing. You could feel something, I am not going to pretend I felt nothing, without allowing what you felt to become a form of interference. What I felt, if I am honest, was something like sorrow. Not dramatic sorrow, not the sorrow of novels, just a quiet, practical recognition that a young woman I knew well, whose hair I had dressed for 3 years, whose silences I could read, who had asked me once, in a moment of unusualness, whether I thought it was difficult to learn a language as an adult, was being moved into a position she had not reached by any exercise of her own will. I wondered sometimes what she thought about in her sleep, whether she dreamed of England. The engagement was announced in November of 1895. I remember the morning because of the way the household changed when a thing that everyone already knows becomes a thing that has been officially said. There is a particular shift, almost imperceptible, but I had been in service long enough to perceive it, in which informality collapses and ceremony begins. Everyone straightens slightly, the tempo changes, the quality of the silences is different. Consuelo came into her dressing room at 8:30, as she always did. I had laid out her morning things, the pale blue wrapper she preferred, the brushes and combs in their order, the small jars of cream and lotion that represented the daily architecture of a society woman's face. She sat before the mirror, and I began to brush her hair. 80 strokes, always 80, though I had never counted aloud. It was simply a rhythm I had arrived at over time, a rhythm that matched some quality of the morning. She looked at herself in the mirror. I looked at her reflection. She said, "It is in the papers this morning." "Yes, Miss Vanderbilt." A pause. The brush moved through her hair. "The Times, the Herald. Mamma has been sent copies." "Yes." "People will call today." "I expect they will." She watched herself being groomed. The face in the mirror was composed and careful and quite young, and I thought, because I was always thinking, it was my failing and my occupation, that there was something in her expression that resembled a person reading a document in a language they are still learning, taking in the words, understanding approximately what they mean, not yet having the ability to feel the full weight of them. "I shall need the ivory wool for morning calls," she said, "and the garnets, not the pearls." "Of course." And that was that. We proceeded through the morning as we always proceeded through mornings. I dressed her and arranged her hair, and she went downstairs to receive her congratulations, and I went to lay out the afternoon things, and then the evening things, and the day was managed. What I remember most, however, is not the morning but the evening. I came to undress her at 11:30, after a dinner that had apparently involved many speeches and a great deal of champagne. She sat in the chair I indicated, and I began the process of the evening. The hair, the pins, the removal of the dress, a worth, the deep burgundy taffeta, which I unhooked with the careful hands of a person who understands what things cost and how they must be cared for. She had said almost nothing throughout. I worked around her silence as I always did, attending to the practical requirements of the body, the dress, the jewels. When I had taken down her hair and was braiding it loosely for the night, she said very quietly, "Anne, do you have family?" I was momentarily surprised by the question. She had never asked before. "A mother, Miss Vanderbilt. 2 sisters, in Wales." "Do you see them?" "At Christmas, when my leave allows." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I don't expect I shall see my mother very often." I did not answer immediately. I thought about what answer was appropriate, and I decided that perhaps no answer was the most appropriate thing. "She will visit," I said finally. "I'm sure she will visit." Consuelo nodded very slightly. I finished the braid. She went to bed. I walked back to my room in the servants' corridor, and I sat on the edge of my narrow mattress, and I thought about the fact that she was 17 years old and about to cross an ocean, and that her mother had arranged for her to cross it, and that the people you love can also be the people who, in the full certainty of their love, put you somewhere you have not chosen. I should tell you about the small moments, because the small moments were where the whole thing lived for me. Large events have their own architecture. They carry their meaning on the outside. But the small moments are where you learn what is actually happening. There was a morning, I think it was mid-November, when the Newport season was properly over and we had come down to New York, to the house on Fifth Avenue, when I found Consuelo in her sitting room with a book about English country houses. It was a large book, the sort with photographs, and she had it open to a photograph of Blenheim Palace. The palace, and it is a palace, truly, despite the English habit of calling large houses other things, is enormous in a way that photographs only partially convey. It sits in its park in Oxfordshire like a sentence that has not decided to end, a vast Baroque composition of stone, with its wings spreading out like arms, and its great court opening toward the avenue of trees. The photograph was taken in summer, when the light lay golden on the stone and the gardens were in their proper arrangement. She was studying it the way one studies a map, with the careful attention of someone trying to learn terrain before she has to traverse it. I said nothing. I went about my business in the room. There were some things to be attended to, some linens to be counted, and she did not look up. After perhaps 10 minutes, she closed the book and set it aside and picked up her correspondence. I put the linens away. I thought, she is trying to imagine herself there. She is trying to see herself in those rooms, in that park, in that light. She is trying to make something that is only a photograph into something she can inhabit. This is what we do when we are going somewhere we have not chosen but must go. We study the images and try to find ourselves inside them. We try to make the strange familiar before it arrives. It is a kind of work, this anticipatory imagining, and it takes something out of you, because you are never quite certain whether the image will hold. The wedding was set for the 6th of November, 1895. That gave us, from the announcement in early November, very little time, though I am told that the discussions between Mrs. Vanderbilt and the Duke had been proceeding for rather longer, and that the date had therefore been part of the arrangement from a fairly early stage. The preparations were extraordinary. I have worked in wealthy households all my adult life, and I had seen preparations for events of significance, balls, dinners, the presentations at court that young women of that class underwent. But the preparation for this wedding was of a different order. It occupied every room of the Fifth Avenue house. Dressmakers, florists, caterers, clergy, lawyers. There was a constant traffic of people through those rooms, and every one of them was attending to some particular aspect of the event, and the event itself seemed to grow the more it was attended to, as though the attention were a kind of nourishment. The trousseau I had watched being fitted over the autumn was now complete. It was enormous. 53 dresses, 15 travelling costumes. The underlinen packed in camphor-wood boxes lined with tissue paper, each item wrapped separately, each box labelled in my own hand. The jewels in their cases, the furs, the accessories, the parasols and gloves and fans and stockings and boots, all catalogued and parcelled and ready. I had a list. I kept the list the way I kept all my lists, precisely, without sentiment, in a small leather-covered notebook that I carried in my apron pocket. I checked items off as they were packed. I verified each box against its label. I made a master list of the master list, because experience had taught me that a single list is only as reliable as the moment it is made, and that a second list, made independently, catches the errors the first one missed. The morning before the wedding, I finished the last of the packing. I stood in the centre of Consuelo's dressing room and looked at the ranked trunks, and I thought, here is a life. Here it is, in boxes. Here are all the costumes she will wear in the theatre of the life she has been given. They are beautiful things. They are very well made. They are going to England. I am not going to describe the wedding in the way a newspaper described the wedding. If you want that description, the white satin and the orange blossom, the church filled to its capacity with the richest gathering of people that New York had assembled in some years, the bridesmaids and the processional and the 8-foot train, you can find it. It was reported extensively. It was considered a great success. What I will tell you is what I observed. Consuelo's face, in the carriage on the way to the church, was not the face of a young woman going to something she had chosen. I do not say this to condemn or to accuse. I say it because I was in that carriage, sitting across from her, and I had 3 years of her face to compare it against, and what I saw was not joy, which I would have recognized, and was not even the complex thing that is not quite joy but is still a form of willingness. What I saw was resolution, which is not the same thing, and which is actually a harder thing, because it requires a great deal more of you. She held her flowers. She looked out the window. She said at one point, "Is my veil straight?" "Yes, Miss Vanderbilt, perfectly straight." She nodded. At the church door, I waited while she went inside. I waited with the other attendants during the ceremony, which I could hear but not see. The organ, the voices, the long particular silences of liturgy. Then the doors opened and they came out, and she was the Duchess of Marlborough, and I curtsied, as one does to a duchess. She smiled at me. It was a good smile, practiced and genuine at once. She had always been able to do that, to smile in a way that was real even when the situation producing it was not entirely real. "Thank you, Anne," she said. I did not know exactly what she was thanking me for. The veil, perhaps, the years of hair, the tissue paper in the boxes, the company of someone who had been in the room through all of it, quietly, attending. "Your Grace," I said. And then the carriages came, and the reception, and the day moved forward as days do. We sailed 2 days later, on the 8th of November, aboard the Cunard steamer that the Duchess's mother had engaged for the crossing. The Southampton sailing was at noon, but there was so much to arrange in the morning, so many final things, that I was awake at 4. I have always been an early riser. In service, it is more or less required. But that particular 4 o'clock had a quality I remember distinctly, a November darkness that was also a sea darkness, because we had gone to the pier the evening before and slept aboard, and the sounds of the harbour were different from the sounds of the house. The water moved against the hull. Somewhere, a chain was paid out across metal. Men called to each other in the dark, in a language of the docks, short and practical, and completely indifferent to the fact that elsewhere on this same vessel, a young woman lay in a stateroom, wondering what she was moving toward. I dressed in my own dark, in the small cabin I shared with no one, another marker of rank. A lady's maid travelling with a duchess has a single cabin, which is a considerable luxury. And I checked my list one more time, and then the Duchess's list, and I satisfied myself that everything was in order, and then I sat in the single chair and waited for it to be time to go to her. She was awake when I came. She had been awake for some time, I thought. The bunk was slightly disordered in the way that suggests a person who has been lying very still but not sleeping, rather than sleeping and then waking. She was wearing the white linen nightgown with the broderie anglaise at the neck, and her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked young in a way she did not always look young, stripped of the architecture, of the gowns and the jewels and the trained bearing, just a tall girl in a nightgown with dark eyes and her hair down. "Good morning, Anne." "Good morning, Your Grace. Shall I do the fire first, or the hair?" "The hair. It takes longest." I began. This was the part of the work I had always found most meditative, the long brushing, the careful arrangement, the pins placed just so. There was a mirror above the small dresser, and we were reflected in it together, her sitting and me standing behind her, and outside the porthole, the sky was beginning to become grey at its edge. "How long does the crossing take?" she asked. 7 days, they tell us, perhaps 8, depending on weather. She watched herself in the mirror. 7 days, and then England. "Yes, Your Grace." She was quiet for a while. I worked through her hair with the patience I had learned over years, the patience that is not passive but active, that requires attention and presence, that is the patience of a person doing something that matters and knowing it. She said, "I shall be very glad to have you there." I paused in my brushing. I was careful about what I said next, because there are things one says to a duchess and things one does not, and the line between them shifts in moments of intimacy without warning. "I am glad to be of use," I said. She looked at my reflection. "That is not what I meant." I held her gaze in the mirror for a moment. "No," I said, "I know it isn't." We left it there. I finished her hair. I helped her dress in the travelling costume, the navy serge, the white collar, the small hat with the single feather, and she looked, when I had done, entirely correct. Entirely the Duchess of Marlborough, prepared to begin her life as such. A Cunard steamer in 1895 was its own country. It had its own rules and its own rhythms and its own social stratifications, reproduced with remarkable fidelity from the world it was floating between. The first-class saloon reproduced the first-class drawing room. The dining room reproduced the dinner party, with its placements and its protocols and its particular performance of ease. Even the deck, where people walked their constitutionals in the morning and took their air in the afternoons, reproduced the park, the promenade, the understood separations of class and gender and purpose that organized life on land. The Duke kept somewhat separate from his wife during the crossing. This surprised me at first, though when I considered it, I understood it. They were still finding the distances between them, the social distances, which in that world were very precisely calibrated. A husband and wife did not spend all their time together. That would have suggested a want of other resources. They had separate arrangements in the public rooms and came together for meals and occasionally on deck, and between these occasions they occupied their own territories. The Duchess's territory was her stateroom, which was large enough for a sitting area, and the ladies' drawing room on B-deck, and the portside walk, which she preferred in the mornings. I accompanied her in all of these places, at the near distance that was my professional station. She read on that crossing. She read more than I had seen her read in Newport or New York. She had brought books, Trollope, I think, and something in French that I didn't recognize, and she read them in the afternoons with a kind of deliberate absorption, as though reading were a place she could go to that was not entirely subject to the arrangements that had been made for her elsewhere. I would sit during these reading hours with my sewing or my mending. There was always sewing or mending, and we would be together in the stateroom in a silence that was perfectly comfortable, the silence of two people who have been in rooms together long enough to have nothing to perform for each other. I have thought about those afternoons since, about the quality of that silence, about how rare it is to have a silence with another person that is not the silence of awkwardness or convention, but simply the silence of presence. She reading, me sewing, the ship moving under us both, carrying us towards something neither of us had chosen, in my case, and only one of us had chosen, in hers. Time on a ship is different from time on land. The days have their markers, the meal times, the watches, the regular announcements of latitude and longitude that the ship's officers posted each noon in the first-class corridor. But between these markers, there is a quality of suspension that belongs specifically to the middle of the ocean, where there is nothing to see but water and sky in the ship's own wake, and where the usual references by which you calibrate your position in time, the building on the corner, the clock on the church, the neighbour's dog that barks at 6, are entirely absent. In this suspension, things get said that might not get said on land. On the 4th day out, when we were somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic and the sky was the colour of pewter and the sea was rolling in long swells that made some passengers prefer their cabins, the Duchess and I were on the portside walk in the early afternoon. She had wanted air despite the weather, which was not unusual. She had always been physical in that way, fond of riding, of walking, of the out-of-doors, and the confinement of the stateroom grated on her. She walked, and I walked. We completed several circuits of the deck in silence, which was our custom. Then she said, into the grey air, "My grandmother had a maid for 40 years. I waited. They were the same age. She came to her when they were both 18, and she stayed until my grandmother died. A pause. I used to think that was very strange. Now I understand it rather better. I thought about how to respond. It is a particular kind of relationship, I said, not like other kinds. No, not like other kinds. She looked at the water. Do you mind very much, going to England? I have never been to England, I said. I have been told it is beautiful. She glanced at me. That isn't what I asked. I considered this. She was right. It wasn't. I go where I am needed, I said. That has always been the shape of my life. She looked at me for a moment, and then she looked back at the water. Yes, she said. I suppose it has been the shape of mine as well. We completed another circuit in silence. I did not point out the difference between the shape that is chosen and the shape that is arranged. I thought she knew it already. I thought we both did. There were 2 or 3 other conversations during that crossing that I have kept, in the same way I kept the list in my notebook, not because I intended to use them for anything, but because some things present themselves as things that must be kept. On the 5th evening, during the dressing for dinner, she asked me to do something with her hair that was different from our usual arrangement. She wanted it higher, more formal. I worked it up into the style she wanted, adding a bandeau of pearls, and when I had done it, she looked at herself with an expression I can only describe as exploratory, as though she were examining someone she was just meeting. It suits you, I said. It is what a duchess looks like, she said. Not proudly, simply as a statement of fact. As a person might say, this is the uniform of the job. Here is what the job looks like on me. You were always going to look the part, I said. Does the part look like me? I thought about this. I was still holding the hairpin case. I closed it carefully. The part is large, I said. There is room in it. She considered this. That is either very reassuring or very frightening, depending on how you look at it. Perhaps both, I said. She went down to dinner. I arranged the stateroom for her return and then went to take my own meal in the appropriate place, which was a smaller, quieter room where the servants travelling first class with their employers ate together, and where the conversation was of another register entirely, practical and oblique, and sometimes very funny, in the way that servants' hall conversations were sometimes funny, with a humour that was the specific product of seeing everything from the outside. I told them nothing of what she said. I never told anyone anything she said. This also was part of the work. On the 7th morning, England appeared. It appeared first as a darkness at the edge of the water, the kind of darkness that might be cloud, except that it does not move the way cloud moves. Then, as the ship drew forward and the light improved, it resolved itself into land. Cliffs, which I had been told were white, and which in the November light were more grey than white, but which were undeniably the cliffs they were reputed to be, those famous cliffs at the entrance to the channel that mean you have arrived at something. I had been awake since 5. I dressed and went to dress the Duchess at her usual time, and she was also already awake and sitting at the small porthole in her nightgown watching the grey shapes that were England. "I can see it," she said when I came in. "Yes, Your Grace." "It looks very serious." I looked past her through the porthole. The cliffs were grey in the November light, with the sea running white at their bases. Very serious was, I thought, not an unreasonable description. "It is the season," I said. "November. It will look different in summer." "Everything looks different in summer," she said. She turned from the porthole and presented herself to be dressed. We went through the morning's work, the hair, the travelling costume, the charcoal grey this time, with the fur trim at collar and cuff, the small hat, the gloves, and I worked with the same precision I always brought to it, and she held herself with the same stillness she always brought to it, and between us was the accumulated weight of 3 years of mornings like this one, all the small repetitions that constitute, over time, a kind of intimacy that has no proper name. When I had finished and she had examined herself in the mirror and found everything in order, she said, "Do I look all right?" This was not a question she usually asked. She had always known whether she looked all right. But perhaps today was different. Perhaps today the question meant something else. "You look exactly right," I said. She held my gaze in the mirror for a moment. Then she nodded once, and that was enough. Southampton in November is not a beautiful place. I mean no disrespect to Southampton. It is what it is, and what it is a working port, with all that implies. The smell of coal and salt water and machinery, the noise of it, the great practical business of the commerce of the sea being conducted all around the ceremony of our arrival. There was a reception at the dock. There were people from the Duke's household and representatives of I don't know how many local dignitaries, and a small group of journalists who had come down from London to document the arrival of the American heiress who was now the Duchess of Marlborough. They kept a respectful distance, largely, but their notebooks were visible and their attention was pointed. The Duke came down the gangway first, and then the Duchess on his arm, and then the rest of the party. And I was in that rest of the party, carrying the case of things that always need to be carried and could not go with the trunks. I followed them through the dock and into the waiting carriages, where I took my place in the second vehicle with some of the other attendants, and we drove through Southampton in a small procession of the kind that suggests importance without making it grotesque. I watched England through the carriage window. It was raining. A fine, persistent November rain that was not dramatic enough to comment on, but which made everything slightly darker than it might otherwise have been. The streets of Southampton were narrow and cobbled in places and grey in others, and the people on them, working people mostly, going about their morning business, looked up briefly at the procession and then went back to what they were doing, which seemed to me exactly right. The world does not stop for the arrival of an American duchess. It barely pauses. We took the train to London. This was another kind of world, the compartments of a British first-class railway carriage, with their antimacassars and their upholstered seats, and the peculiar intimacy that rail travel imposes, everyone contained together in a moving box and pretending not to notice. The Duke and Duchess had a compartment to themselves. I sat in the next one with the other attendants, and outside the window, England went past. Fields and hedges and villages with their churches, the bare November trees, the occasional flash of a river, all of it greyed and softened by the rain and the speed. I thought, here I am, in England, going toward Blenheim. It was not a dramatic thought. It was simply the plain fact of the matter, stated to myself as I sometimes stated things to myself in quiet moments, as a way of knowing where I was. We stopped in London first. A night at Blenheim could wait. There were calls to be made, arrangements to be confirmed, and the Duke's family in London were to receive the new Duchess. I will not describe those introductions in detail, partly because I was not present for the formal parts of them, and partly because what matters to me here is not the public event, but the private aftermath. When they brought her back to the house in the evening, and she came upstairs to be undressed, the evening had left its mark on her in the way evenings sometimes do. A particular exhaustion that is not physical so much as social. The exhaustion of having been attended to very closely for several hours by people who are trying to determine what you are. She sat in the chair. I took off the earrings first, then the bracelet, then the tiara. She had been given the Marlborough tiara for the evening, a heavy thing of diamonds that had sat on the heads of duchesses for 2 centuries, and which had a weight to it that was not only physical. I put it in its case with appropriate care. These were historic jewels. I was aware of this. "They are very kind," she said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Very formal." "That is the English way, I believe." "Yes." She looked at her hands, which I had freed from their gloves. "They will not always be so formal, I imagine." "One hopes." She smiled very slightly at my careful phrasing. "You are very diplomatic, Anne." "I try to be useful." "You are. You always are." She looked at her hands again, then up. "I am very tired." "Yes, you should sleep." She submitted to the remainder of the undressing with the compliance of genuine exhaustion, no longer performing patience, just actually tired, which was different. And when I had her in her nightgown and her hair braided and she was in the bed, she looked like the girl I had first attended 3 years before. Very young, very still. "Tomorrow," she said, "we go to Blenheim." "Yes." "I shall have to become someone else," she said. "The someone who lives at Blenheim." I stood by the door. "You will take yourself with you," I said, "as one always does." She thought about this. "Yes," she said, "I suppose one does." She closed her eyes. I turned down the lamp and went out and closed the door very quietly, as one does when someone is on the verge of sleep, and the sleep matters. I have saved Blenheim for last, not because it was last. We arrived there on the following afternoon, and it was to be my home for the better part of the next several years, but because the first sight of it requires a proper approach. You cannot arrive at Blenheim casually. The road from Woodstock winds through the park, a great deer park, old trees, the brown grass of November, and then you pass through a gate, and the road continues, and then, suddenly, there it is. The whole enormous thing, all at once, as if it had been placed there specifically to be seen, which, in a sense, it had been. It is too large to take in all at once. The eye moves across it and keeps moving, across the towers and the portico and the wings spreading out on either side, all of it in golden Oxfordshire stone that even in November, even under grey sky, has a warmth to it, the warmth of the stone itself, which has been standing there absorbing English light for 200 years. The carriage stopped at the great door, and I stepped down with the others, and I looked up at the house, and I thought, this is real. This extraordinary, impossible thing is real, and she is going to live in it, and I am going to help her live in it. The house people were assembled, the indoor staff in their livery, in 2 rows on the steps, and the Duke and Duchess went through, and greetings were made, and everything was conducted with that English formality that is not unkind, but which requires some practice to move through gracefully. I came in after, with the travelling things. A housekeeper met me, an Englishwoman of my own age, severe and competent, who had been at Blenheim for 15 years, and she showed me the Duchess's apartments, which were on the 1st floor, and which looked out over the formal gardens toward the lake. The gardens were bare in November, the hedges clipped back to their essential shapes, the beds empty. The lake was pewter grey. Beyond the gardens, the park continued into distance, the old trees leafless now, the deer visible in small groups among them. I stood at the window of the Duchess's dressing room for a moment, after the housekeeper had gone, and I looked at the park. I thought about Anne of Blenheim, not Anne Wilkes, but the other Anne, Queen Anne, who had given this place to the first Duke of Marlborough as a gift for the Battle of Blenheim, and about all the women who had stood in rooms like this one and looked at the park for the first time. About how many of them had arrived by arrangement rather than by choice. About how many of them had found, over time, that the room and the park and even the heaviness of the house became a kind of home, not through affection necessarily, but through the long work of inhabiting a place until it knows you. There were footsteps in the corridor, and then the door, and it was the Duchess. She came in and stood beside me at the window. She looked out at the bare gardens, at the grey lake, at the November park. "Well," she said. "Well," I agreed. She was quiet for a while. Then, "It is very large." "Yes, Your Grace." "Larger than the photographs?" "Always." She turned from the window and looked around the dressing room, which was a large room by any standard, and which was hung with rose-coloured silk and had a dressing table of elaborate gilt that belonged to another century. She looked at the trunks that had preceded us, which were stacked along one wall, her things in their boxes, her costumes for the life she was now to begin. "You'll know where everything is," she said. "Of course." "You'll help me find my way." I looked at her steadily. "As much as I am able," I said. "Yes," she nodded. A nod that was, I thought, an acknowledgement of something more than the question she had asked. An acknowledgement of a particular kind of partnership, one that had no name in the language available to us, no social category to contain it, but which was real nevertheless, and which would carry us both through what was coming. "I should dress for dinner," she said. "I have the grey silk laid out," I said. "The pearls, I think. Not the tiara. Not tonight." "No, not the tiara tonight." She began to unbutton her jacket, and I moved to help her, and we began the work of the evening as we had begun the work of all the evenings before it, with the quiet efficiency of two people who have made a practice of each other, who have learned the distances and the proximities that make a thing like this possible, who have arrived, together, at the place where they are going, whatever that place turns out to be. I stayed with the Duchess of Marlborough for 11 years. I left her service in 1906, when I married a man who kept a small hotel in Cheltenham, and by then the world we had entered together at Blenheim had changed a great deal. There had been children and difficulties, and the long, slow negotiation between two people from very different countries, trying to make a life in a house that had opinions about what life should be. She found her way. This is the thing I would want you to know, if you are still awake and still with me in these pages. She was not a person designed for defeat, whatever the circumstances of her arrival in England. She found her way through the size of the house and the weight of the title and the particular difficulties of her marriage, and she found things in that English world that she had not expected to find. Causes and convictions and a quality of engagement with the world that was entirely her own. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The story I set out to tell is the story of 1895, of the summer in Newport and the fittings and the announcement and the crossing and the first sight of Blenheim. That is the story I know from the inside, from the particular angle of someone who was always present, but never at the centre. What is the centre in a story like this? I have turned this question over many times in the years since. Is the centre the decision, and who made it? Is it the crossing, and what was left behind? Is it the arrival, and what was found? I think, in the end, the centre is something smaller than all of these. The centre is a girl at a window in Newport, watching the sea in October and asking whether Blenheim is cold in winter. The centre is an ocean at night, when you cannot sleep, and the sounds of the water against the hull. The centre is a room in Oxfordshire and a bare November park, and a woman beginning the work of inhabiting a life that has been given to her, with all the courage and the practicality that such work requires. I was there for all of it. That is what I have to offer. Not the full story, which belongs to her, but the witness of it, which is mine alone. I was not invisible. None of us who are ever called invisible are truly invisible. We see, and we remember, and the memory is a kind of testimony. It says, "This happened. I was there. She was there." The ship moved across the water, and the cliffs were grey, and the trunks arrived at Blenheim, and she stood at the window and looked at the park, and said, "Well." She said, "Well." And then she got dressed for dinner. And I helped her.